Chinese investors received a record number of U.S. patents last year and are likely to overtake Germany in the number 4 position of top recipients, according to an analysis of filings with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. Chinese investors received 12,500 U.S. patents in 2018, a 12% jump on the year and a 10-fold increase over what they received a decade ago. Phone maker Huawei ranked 16th in terms of most patents filed, followed by fellow Chinese company BOE Technology. The U.S. still dominates the field, followed by companies based in Japan, South Korea and Germany. But overall, the number of patents issued by the U.S. Patent Office declined 3.5% for the year, with every major country except China receiving fewer patents than the year before. Under the patent system enshrined in the U.S. Constitution, investors agree to publicize how to duplicate their ideas for others to build on and in return get exclusive rights to the invention for 20 years from the date of the application. So what do these figures say about innovation in China, and do they refute the arguments being leveled against China that it simply wants to stake others' intellectual property? Joining me from Boston's Northeastern University are Professor Ravi Ramamurti, and here in Beijing I'm joined by Edward Lehman, Managing Director of Lehman and Xu LLP. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. Professor Ramamurti, let me go to you first. Overall, the number of patents issued by the Patent Office declined 3.5% for the year, as I said, with every major country except China receiving fewer patents than the year before. What accounts for China bucking the global trend?
Well, I think China is in a period of secular growth in its spending on research and development. Spending by China on R&D has been growing at about double digits for the last few years. I think that trend is continuing. Until China catches up, we will probably see this kind of a pattern in which the numbers steadily go up for China, the spending goes up steadily for China, while for other countries, which are much more mature in this process, they're going to have fluctuations from year to year based on the economic outlook, based on the cost of capital and things like that.
Edward, just how important to the Chinese economy is this increase in the number of Chinese patents around the world?
Well, I mean, it's extremely important, of course. I mean, innovation and ideas is where money comes from. So, I mean, I remember from way back when I was in law school, my property professor says, how does somebody become wealthy? And I was like, I don't know. And he said, it's owning something that appreciates rapidly. That's what intellectual property does. As you outlined in the introduction, I mean, it gives someone 20 years exclusivity, a monopoly, to be able to own and use that right exclusively and then license it to others. That's how patents are made. So, for example, you can own, you can have a patent on ham. This is hyperbolic, of course, but you have to have a ham there could be a patent on a ham sandwich, and so to use that, those two things together, you have to have standard essential patents. And so these, for example, your telephone might have 25 standard essential patents. Each of those is a license. Each of those is a stream of income. And therefore, it actually adds to the economy in many, many ways, in a multiplicity of ways in order to go forward. So it's really important.
Professor Ramamurti, you were talking about China still being very much a growing economy, whereas the more mature Western or developed Western countries or other countries in the world would enjoy fluctuation in the number of patents that they file. And yet, I still think the number or the rate of increase is quite amazing. I mean, the number of invention patents lodged in the Chinese mainland last year reached 1.6 million. That's an 18% increase, almost 1/5 over the previous year, and the number of domestic trademark registration rose by nearly 1/3. How do you interpret these figures, especially against the relatively slower rate of GDP growth for the Chinese economy over the past few years?
Well, I think these numbers, as you are suggesting, are very impressive. The growth is quite extraordinary, and even though it may be from a smaller base, every year the base is getting larger and larger. So to register 18% growth on a large base is very impressive. I think what it shows is like what we saw happening with China in manufacturing and low-end manufacturing, double-digit growth year after year as China caught up in manufacturing. We're seeing, I think, the same thing playing out now with regard to innovation. And China, from being largely a consumer of innovations and intellectual property, is in process of becoming a major producer of intellectual property. I think there is no question that that is the big story here, which is China has now embarked on this journey. It is really seems to have caught fire. You're seeing lots of entrepreneurs, lots of venture investments. I think entrepreneurs, and especially in the private sector now, are recognizing that intellectual property, as Edward indicated, is the way to fortune.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're seeing all these rapidly expanding numbers of filings for patents and trademarks.
Okay. Well, although the number of patents and trademarks in China has been ranked first in the world for a number of consecutive years, and yet many people are arguing quantity is not the same as quality. At the same time, we're seeing data which show that the added value of China's patent-intensive industries accounted for over 12% of the Chinese GDP. So, Edward, is it possible to compare the value of Chinese patents against American patents on a worldwide scale?
Here's the whole thing about it. I've been involved in intellectual property for my entire career, and I mean, as Benjamin Disraeli famously said, there's lies, there's bigger lies, and then there's statistics. When we're talking about statistics with regards to patents and intellectual property, we have to understand that we need to talk about the same thing. With the growth in the intellectual property filings in China, that includes foreigners who are filing patents and trademarks from abroad. You did bring in statistics that there was an increase year on year with regards to locally or domestically filed trademarks. That's an interesting point, because as someone who's spent a lot of time here in China now, that before Chinese individuals were not allowed to file. I mean, it was literally, it was on the laws you could file, but they weren't allowed to file because they weren't legal persons. Now that they're able to file, I think there's a rise in entrepreneurship. They're filing and protecting trademarks. When we talk about the increase in patentability in the National Intellectual Property Administration, which is what the new name of it, we're actually talking about people that are fighting over the China market. And so these are foreigners, these are local Chinese. And do I think quantity is quality? The answer is no, it is not. I mean, but also you understand that China now, we're filing more, with all these statistics, we're filing more applications in China than in Japan, in Germany, in US, and South Korea combined, okay, just so we're clear on the number. And this means that they're fighting over this very large market, which has, 1.4 billion people, or 300 million that's in that middle class that can afford things that patents protect.
Yeah. Well, I think, as many things, the Chinese that we have seen over the past 40 years, you first expand on the number, and then gradually you go up in the quality. That seems also to be a natural path of how things have been developing. Professor Ramamurti, the Trump administration contends that China is stealing American know-how, yet the steady rise of the numbers that we have just been talking about suggests Chinese companies are trying to develop their own technology. The U.S. Patent Office has a process to challenge patents filed that are based on stolen ideas, and yet few such proceedings have been filed against anyone. So doesn't this undermine the American charges leveled against China of IP theft?
Not necessarily. It's possible that both things could be true. There could have been a period in which there was some stealing of IP going on, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the companies doing the stealing were then subsequently filing their own patents or filing them overseas, and therefore you had to go after them. It could have been a set of players who were simply using it as a way to catch up and improve their products for the local market. At the same time, I don't think, even if that happened, it doesn't take away from the fact that China today is a very important center for innovation. It is not just in the business of stealing and copying. It is now seriously in the business of trying to produce its own intellectual property. And as I said before, the big story, I think, here is that China is going from being a consumer of intellectual property to wanting to be a serious producer of intellectual property. And I would argue that possibly that the US-China trade war has actually speeded up, maybe even accelerated, China's rate of innovation and trying to master various intellectual fields of intellectual property. So I think in what is happening here, you cannot for a moment doubt that what China is engaged in here is a serious effort to produce intellectual property on its own. Now you can say the cup is half full or cup is half empty, depending on how you look at this. You know, you can say China is not as far advanced as the US, but the cup half full argument is that China is moving so fast that it's only a matter of time before China becomes one of the top. It's already in the top 5. It'll keep moving up as it has in some other indicators.
Well, I think the Chinese are very good at learning things, you know, from everywhere, whether you call it steal or whether you call it copy or whether you call it emulate. We do want to look around and see what is good from what other people are doing and then try to emulate at least that spirit, if not copy the exact steps of the process. Edward, what's your take on this same question?
Yeah, I mean, when you look around the United States where the professor is, for example, I mean, you've got people in postgraduate and graduate degrees that are of Chinese descent, and I mean, they're in the majority probably when you take those from the subcontinent, from where, you know, India and those places as well. So I do think that a lot of this is actually coming from, you know, Chinese and Asians that are in the United States. Yes, I think Chinese are, you know, they do, you know, imitation is the highest form of praise. And I think that they're, you know, remember that patents were only introduced in 1984. They wrote the patent law in 1992. They, you know, changed it again 3 times. And what they're doing is they're making tremendous strides with regards to the implementation of patents. And they've just, in the last National People's Congress, and they've changed up how to administer this stuff. So they're making huge efforts in a very large country with the second largest economy.
And some people are arguing that it's widely claimed that patents actually do more to hinder innovation than encouraging it. Edward, very quickly, what do you say to that?
Absolutely, positively. That's why they have the open source movement. The open source movement is to say let it all be free and let it all be out there. And that's what we're seeing a lot in Shenzhen, which is a lot of cooperation rather than filing of patents down there. So.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Many thanks to my 2 guests from Boston Northeastern University, Professor Ravi Ramamurti, and here in Beijing, Edward Lehman, Managing Director of Lehman and Shu LLP.